Not a battle fought with swords, not a public war for the throne. This is a war over the narrative, and whoever controls the truth controls the future of the monarchy. When reports leaked that Prince Harry had attempted to reach Prince William through a mutual friend to arrange a private conversation, public opinion split instantly. One side claimed the door had been shut by the heir himself. The other asked a far more dangerous question. Did this so-called intermediary ever truly exist? Meanwhile, the interviews with Oprah and Anderson Cooper, the memoir Spare and then Endgame, continued to churn the headlines. Old accusations resurfaced, old fractures were magnified, and in the middle of the media storm, William remained silent. But that silence was not weakness. When Harry launched legal action over security and a public hearing was opened, the past began to resurface. Bougie's 2007, Las Vegas internal disputes, formal denials of physical violence, and then just as the narrative began to frame William as isolated King Charles, unexpectedly met with Harry in what was described as a slight thaw. The question now is unavoidable. Was this the beginning of reconciliation or a calculated move to protect the heir? The door of succession has never opened for intermediaries. And this time, it will not open under pressure. London, 15 February 2026, Buckingham Palace. At precisely 9:12 a.m., under a grey and windless sky that pressed low over them all, a formal clarification was issued from within the communications office of Buckingham Palace, a clarification brief in length, yet immense in institutional consequence. It did not name Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, directly. It did not reference any specific interview or book, but the language was unmistakably precise. No formal request for a mediated or third-party meeting has been received by the office of His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales. The position of the household remains unchanged. The statement, though measured and restrained, was released in response to mounting reports circulating in American media outlets alleging that Prince Harry had sought to arrange a private conversation with his brother, Prince William, Prince of Wales, through what was described as a mutual friend. Within hours, the story had fractured public opinion across 2 continents. Some commentators framed the report as proof that the future king had refused reconciliation. Others questioned the foundation of the claim itself. Who was this intermediary? Why had no formal record of contact been logged within the administrative channels of the Prince of Wales's private office? In constitutional monarchies, perception is not a trivial matter. Narrative shapes legitimacy. Legitimacy safeguards continuity. And continuity, above all else, protects the crown. Prince William understood this better than anyone. To acknowledge the existence of a mediator and reject the request would allow the narrative to crystallize around him as the brother who closed the door. To deny knowledge of any such approach risked accusations of evasion. To engage publicly would legitimize the premise itself. He chose a third course. He declined to step into a framework constructed outside the constitutional apparatus of the monarchy. Inside Kensington Palace, senior advisors and legal staff reviewed the language of the statement repeatedly before its release, aware that even a single misplaced clause could be interpreted as either admission or hostility. The phrasing was deliberate. No formal request has been received. It did not accuse, it did not speculate. It merely asserted administrative fact. The timing of the report was not accidental. In the preceding weeks, American media had revisited Prince Harry's high-profile interviews with Oprah Winfrey and Anderson Cooper, replaying segments in which he detailed grievances against the royal family, including allegations contained in his memoir, Spare. In that memoir, Prince Harry described a confrontation in which he claimed Prince William had physically knocked him to the floor during an argument over Meghan, Duchess of Sussex. The accusation had been one of the most damaging assertions made in recent royal history. Not because it was legally substantiated, it was not, but because it penetrated the symbolic architecture of fraternal unity upon which the monarchy depends. It transformed a private dispute into a public fracture. Now, in early 2026, those claims were once again circulating, amplified by renewed discussion surrounding Endgame, the book by Omid Scobie that emphasized prolonged silence between the brothers and depicted an entrenched estrangement within the institution. The alleged intermediary story appeared within that atmosphere not as an isolated anecdote, but as the next logical escalation in a long chain of mediated grievances. If Prince William responded emotionally, he would confirm the narrative of division. If he refuted it aggressively, he would energize it further. So he did neither. In constitutional governance, silence can be an instrument of authority. It signals that the institution does not respond to every provocation, particularly those lacking procedural standing. Behind the scenes, however, silence did not mean inaction. Within the legal and communications departments of the household of the Prince of Wales, a structured review process was initiated. Archival correspondence was examined. Logs of inbound communications were verified. Staff members within the private office confirmed that no formal approach, written, telephonic, or through recognised diplomatic channels, had been recorded. The conclusion was administrative, not emotional. No such mediated request had entered the official system. This distinction mattered, because monarchy, in the modern British constitutional order, functions not merely through personal relationships, but through codified process. Requests are logged. Meetings are scheduled through defined channels. Communications pass through offices accountable to both tradition and public scrutiny. To suggest that an informal, unnamed mutual friend could override that structure was to misunderstand or intentionally bypass the machinery of the Crown. The media cycle, however, was less concerned with procedural nuance. On American networks, panels debated whether Prince William was blocking reconciliation. Clips from Oprah's 2021 interview resurfaced. Alongside excerpts from Anderson Cooper's conversation with Prince Harry, the phrase "closed door" began trending. Within hours of the palace clarification, Omid Scobie posted commentary reiterating that bridges require effort from both sides. The implication was subtle yet potent. Reconciliation had been attempted. Resistance had come from the heir. Prince William did not counter publicly. He had learned, perhaps more sharply than any previous heir, that the modern monarchy survives not by matching noise with noise, but by demonstrating structural steadiness under pressure. Inside the palace, advisors briefed him on the evolving media landscape. They presented analysis charts illustrating public sentiment shifts. They noted the risk that continued allegations, especially those revived from Spare, could erode confidence among younger demographics. William listened. He did not instruct retaliation. He instructed documentation. A comprehensive internal dossier began to take form not for public dissemination, but for institutional record. It included verified timelines of past communications, official denials regarding the physical altercation claim, and references to prior interviews that had placed the monarchy under scrutiny. The purpose was not vengeance, it was preservation, because history has shown that the British monarchy does not collapse from singular scandals. It weakens when narrative control slips from the custodians of constitutional continuity into the hands of fragmented, competing storytellers. As February drew to a close, the alleged intermediary story began to cool in the news cycle, yet its implications lingered. The question remained suspended. Had Prince William rejected peace? The palace's answer, grounded in administrative fact, was unequivocal. No request had been received. No mediator had been acknowledged. No procedural pathway had been initiated. And in that vacuum, a deeper reality became evident. This was not merely a dispute between Prince William and Prince Harry. It was the opening phase of a renewed struggle over authorship, over who defines the truth of the modern monarchy. The heir chose not to step into a script written elsewhere. Instead, quietly and methodically, the institution began compiling its own record. Because in constitutional history, the documents that remain unseen often prove more decisive than the interviews broadcast worldwide. And this dossier, still incomplete, would soon intersect with a far more public arena, one that neither brother could entirely control. By the morning following Buckingham Palace's formal clarification regarding the alleged intermediary, the narrative had already shifted terrain. The absence of a recorded request did not extinguish the story, it intensified it. If no mediator existed within official channels, then the implication repeated across American networks was that reconciliation had been attempted informally and rebuffed institutionally. It was within that recalibrated atmosphere that Endgame, authored by Omid Scobie, re-entered the centre of public discourse. Although the book had been published earlier, its thesis was now being recirculated with renewed urgency. Commentators quoted passages emphasising the complete breakdown of communication between Prince William and Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex. Headlines distilled the message into sharper language. No contact, no dialogue, no bridge left standing. The framing was precise. If Chapter 1 had raised the question of whether William had closed a door, Chapter 2 sought to demonstrate that the door had not merely been closed, it had been sealed for years. Because the palace had denied the existence of a formal intermediary, Endgame became, by default, the principal counterweight in the public arena. The book was cited as contextual proof that estrangement was long-standing, systemic, and crucially centred on the Prince of Wales. The cause and effect sequence was unmistakable. A denial had been issued. Therefore, a narrative required reinforcement. Endgame provided that reinforcement. Within the book's revived excerpts, a particular detail resurfaced with amplified significance. Omid Scobie had previously recounted that on her final working day at Buckingham Palace, Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, had told him she did not believe she would ever return to the United Kingdom. The quotation, simple yet resonant, was repeated across digital platforms. "I don't think I'll ever come back to the UK." At the time it was first reported, the remark had been interpreted as an expression of emotional finality, a declaration of separation from an institution perceived as inhospitable. Now, in the wake of the intermediary controversy, the statement acquired a different weight. If Meghan had declared departure as permanent, then any new suggestion of return demanded explanation. Because by the afternoon of 16 February, another rumour began circulating, this time less substantiated but strategically potent. Anonymous sources suggested that Meghan might consider returning to Britain during the summer, nearly 4 years after her last official engagement. The juxtaposition was immediate and deliberate. First, a claim of irreparable distance. Then, a whisper of possible re-entry. The media cycle interpreted this as evolution, perhaps even maturity. But within Kensington Palace, analysts observed something more calculated. If Meghan's earlier statement had signalled closure, then the prospect of her return could be framed as magnanimity. And if such a return coincided with speculation that King Charles III remained open to maintaining communication with Prince Harry, even at a minimal level, the optics would be unmistakable. The emerging storyline risked becoming this: Harry seeks connection. Charles remains receptive. Meghan softens her stance. William stands apart. Prince William did not require polling data to grasp the implications. The constitutional architecture of the British monarchy rests not solely on legal succession, but on perceived moral continuity. The heir must embody stability, not isolation. If public discourse were allowed to position King Charles III and Prince Harry as capable of measured thaw, even hypothetically, while portraying William as the singular obstacle, the visual symmetry of succession would be subtly distorted. It was not yet fact. It was, at this stage, hypothesis. But in modern constitutional systems, hypothesis can mature into accepted narrative if left unchallenged. William convened a closed internal briefing that afternoon, not to craft a rebuttal. No such statement was issued, but to analyse trajectory. Communications advisors mapped media amplification patterns. Legal counsel reviewed citations from Endgame. Institutional historians contextualised the power of exile and return symbolism within monarchical tradition. The pattern was coherent. The intermediary story had raised a question about William's willingness to reconcile. Endgame reinforced the narrative of entrenched silence. Meghan's revived, quote, established emotional rupture. The rumour of her possible summer return introduced the image of renewal, and in that layered construction, the Prince of Wales risked being cast not as custodian of continuity, but as impediment to it. William understood something fundamental. This was no longer a matter of personal grievance. It was a reputational recalibration campaign. Because if the public could be persuaded that reconciliation was plausible everywhere except at the level of the heir, then the symbolic authority of the succession would be eroded without a single constitutional act being altered. He did not respond publicly, but internally the implications were documented with increasing precision. The distinction between family disagreement and institutional destabilization became the organizing principle of discussion. Advisors articulated it plainly. This is not about emotion. It is about structural optics. Every revived quote, every excerpt, every rumour of return carried cumulative weight, not individually decisive, but collectively directional. And the direction was clear. The intermediary claim had failed to establish procedural legitimacy. Therefore, the narrative pivoted to moral framing. If William could not be shown to have refused a meeting, he could be shown to have maintained distance. And if distance could be equated with rigidity, then rigidity could be contrasted with openness elsewhere. The effect would not be immediate. It would be incremental. Yet monarchy, perhaps more than any other institution, survives or weakens on increments. As evening fell over London on 16 February 2026, the press cycle intensified rather than receded. Panels debated the possibility of summer appearances. Analysts speculated cautiously, tentatively, about whether King Charles might support gradual normalisation. No confirmation existed. No meeting had been announced. But the suggestion alone was sufficient to reposition the conversation, and Prince William recognised, with characteristic restraint, that if the narrative now centred on hypothetical reconciliation, particularly one in which he appeared peripheral, the next arena of contest would not be rumour, but record. Because when perception shifts from, did he refuse, to why is he absent, the battleground inevitably moves from speculation to documented history. And documented history, unlike rumour, demands evidence. By the time dusk settled over the palace gardens, the communications storm ignited by the intermediary claim and reinforced through renewed excerpts from Endgame had already altered the terrain. What had begun as a question about whether Prince William had refused contact was evolving into something more consequential, a challenge to the integrity of the historical record itself. It was precisely because the narrative had shifted from allegation to moral framing that the legal department of the household of the Prince of Wales moved from observation to action. At 7:05 p.m, in a secure conference room inside Kensington Palace, the senior legal advisor placed a thick, leather-bound file on the table before Prince William. It bore no title on the cover. Inside, however, it contained a comprehensive internal dossier compiled over the previous 48 hours, not as retaliation, not as a media strategy, but as an institutional safeguard. The sequence was deliberate and causally precise. First, the claim of a mutual friend, intermediary. Second, the palace's formal denial of any official request. Third, the amplification of estrangement through revived excerpts from Spare and Endgame. Each stage had progressively blurred the boundary between assertion and accepted fact. The risk was no longer reputational discomfort, it was archival distortion. The dossier's first section addressed the immediate catalyst, documented confirmation that no formal request for mediated dialogue had been received by the office of His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales. Email logs were cross-referenced, administrative intake registries were reviewed, staff attestations were recorded in signed memoranda. The language within the file was technical and unemotional. A comprehensive review of communications channels, including written correspondence, telephonic records, and intermediary submissions through recognised diplomatic pathways, confirms no procedural request for mediated engagement was received between January 2024 and February 2026. The phrasing mattered. It did not accuse Prince Harry of fabrication. It did not speculate on informal conversations beyond institutional reach. It merely established that within the constitutional framework governing royal communications, no such request had entered the official record. Because the intermediary claim had attempted to create moral pressure, the response required administrative clarity. The second section of the dossier addressed the allegation most corrosive to the Prince of Wales's public standing. The assertion in Spare that he had physically attacked his brother during a private confrontation. Rather than rhetorical denial, the file contained contemporaneous internal notes from staff present in adjacent offices at the time of the reported argument. It included security log timestamps, verifying movements within the residence, and summaries prepared in accordance with standard protocol following any internal disturbance. The conclusion was consistent across documents. There had been raised voices. Yes, there had been a heated exchange, but there was no corroborated evidence of physical assault. Again, the distinction was crucial. In a hereditary monarchy, the heir's moral credibility is inseparable from his constitutional legitimacy. An unchallenged allegation of violence, even within a domestic context, could, over time, undermine public trust in the integrity of succession. Therefore, the record required precision. The third section of the dossier extended further back, not because it was newly relevant, but because the narrative environment had made it so. If the intermediary claim had positioned Prince Harry as the conciliatory party and Spare had framed him as injured, then historical context demanded balance. The legal team had retrieved archived documentation concerning the events of 2007 outside the Boogies nightclub in London, where Prince Harry had been photographed, leaving inebriated and allegedly engaging physically with paparazzi. Included were contemporaneous press reports, internal security summaries, and public statements issued at the time. The purpose was not character indictment, it was contextual continuity. Because once litigation and memoir transform private grievances into public evidence, all prior public conduct becomes relevant to narrative coherence. Adjacent to those records were archived articles from the Daily Mail discussing whether Prince Harry might face disciplinary review within the military following the Bougies incident, particularly in light of his anticipated deployment to Iraq. The dossier did not assert causation regarding the subsequent decision not to deploy him. It simply documented the public discourse as it existed in 2007. And then came the final section, media archives, relating to the Las Vegas photographs and a controversial Nazi costume worn at a private party years earlier episodes that had already entered the historical ledger of public controversy. Each document had once been processed, addressed, and absorbed by the institution. None were resurrected out of spite. They were included because narrative asymmetry, the selective recollection of events, can, if left uncorrected, produce distortion. Prince William listened as the legal advisor summarized the compilation's purpose. This is not for publication, the advisor clarified. It is for institutional preservation. If the public record is challenged, we must possess documented continuity. William nodded. He had no intention of releasing the dossier. To do so would escalate the conflict from narrative correction to open confrontation. An open confrontation in a constitutional monarchy carries unpredictable institutional cost. Yet he understood equally that silence without documentation is vulnerability. The intermediary claim had forced the palace to clarify process. The revival of Spare had required reaffirmation of fact. The amplification of estrangement had necessitated historical context. Each action had produced a reaction. Each reaction required structured response. The dossier was not an offensive instrument. It was a defensive archive, a mechanism ensuring that if the history of this period were ever formally contested, the institution would not rely on memory alone. As the meeting concluded, the file was returned to secure storage. No press release followed. No counter-accusation emerged. Publicly, the Prince of Wales remained silent. Privately, the institutional record had been fortified, because in modern constitutional conflict, battles are rarely won through headlines alone. They are decided in hearings, in inquiries, in the slow examination of documented fact against televised claim. And by choosing to document rather than denounce, William had ensured that if the struggle moved from rumour to adjudication, the Crown would enter that arena prepared. London, 18 February 2026, Royal Courts of Justice, 3 a.m. Because the intermediary narrative had failed to gain procedural footing and the internal dossier had secured documentary continuity, the conflict inevitably migrated to a forum where documentation could no longer remain theoretical. Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, had pursued legal action against the British government concerning the withdrawal and restructuring of his state-funded security arrangements. What began as an administrative dispute over protection protocols quickly evolved into a public reckoning over credibility, conduct, and competing narratives. The courtroom was filled beyond capacity. Media organisations from the United Kingdom and the United States broadcast live updates. Analysts described it as one of the most consequential royal-adjacent hearings in recent years, not merely because of the security question itself, but because the broader history between the brothers hovered unavoidably in the background. Stephen Wright, senior journalist for the Daily Mail, was called to testify regarding prior reporting connected to Prince Harry's conduct and public controversies. His testimony reopened archival moments that had long been absorbed into public memory. But the escalation did not originate with right. It originated with context. Because Prince Harry's legal team had argued that persistent media intrusion and reputational harm necessitated enhanced security measures, the court was compelled to examine whether that harm stemmed exclusively from press misconduct, or whether prior public conduct had materially contributed to risk exposure. The Boo Gees nightclub incident of 2007 was revisited. Photographs of Prince Harry leaving inebriated, arms extended toward photographers, were entered into evidentiary review. The subsequent public debate regarding military discipline and the decision not to deploy him to Iraq were referenced as contextual background. What had once been episodic headlines were now procedural elements. As Stephen Wright described his reporting process, Harry's legal team subjected him to aggressive cross-examination, challenging sourcing methods and intent. The tone escalated rapidly. The presiding judge intervened twice to restore decorum. Yet the deeper inflection point came not from Wright's testimony, but from the necessity to address claims contained in Spare, specifically the allegation that Prince William had physically assaulted his brother during a confrontation. Until this moment, the palace had issued only structured denials through official statements. Now, because the broader dispute had entered public adjudication, the heir himself was compelled to articulate his position with precision. When Prince William was asked whether he wished to clarify the account presented in Spare, he did not hesitate. His voice was measured, neither defensive nor rhetorical. "I wish to state clearly and without ambiguity," he began, "that while my brother and I have experienced disagreements, as many siblings do, I have never physically assaulted him." The courtroom remained silent. "There was a verbal argument," William continued. "There were raised voices, but there was no act of violence. There was no physical attack. There was no intent to cause harm." He paused briefly before adding, "I will not allow a private disagreement to be transformed into a public allegation of assault when no such assault occurred." Because the memoir had framed the incident as a moment of aggression, William addressed it directly. "I categorically deny that I knocked my brother to the floor," he stated. "I categorically deny that I engaged in physical violence. I will accept responsibility for words spoken in frustration. I will not accept responsibility for actions that did not take place." The precision of his language was deliberate. He did not dismiss the existence of tension. He did not minimize emotional strain. He delineated a boundary between argument and assault. "My duty," he continued, "is to uphold the integrity of the institution I serve. That duty includes correcting the record when it is inaccurate." When questioned about whether his silence in previous years could be interpreted as tacit acknowledgement, William responded, "Silence in a constitutional monarchy is not admission, it is restraint. There is a distinction." He elaborated further. "I chose not to engage publicly at the time because I believed that escalating a familial disagreement into public dispute would harm the Crown more than it would clarify the truth. However, when that disagreement is memorialized as violence, and when that characterization is used to influence public perception and policy, I have an obligation to respond." The judge asked whether William wished to comment on the broader pattern of media exposure surrounding his brother. "I do not sit in judgment of my brother's choices," William replied. "I address only what concerns my conduct, and on that matter I am unequivocal. There was no physical attack. The repetition was intentional." Outside the courtroom, commentators began recalibrating their analysis. The simplicity of the denial, firm, direct, and devoid of embellishment, contrasted sharply with the layered narrative previously circulating in memoir form. But the hearing continued, because if the security claim rested on a portrayal of Prince Harry as uniquely endangered by hostile media pursuit, the evidentiary review required revisiting prior instances where media attention intersected with voluntary public exposure. The Bougies incident was again referenced. William did not elaborate extensively, but when asked whether he believed prior public conduct could influence media intensity, he answered carefully. Media interest in members of the royal family is not new. It is not conditional, but behaviour can affect focus. That is a matter of public record. He did not accuse. He did not editorialise. He allowed the implication to stand. The cumulative effect of his statements shifted the tone of proceedings. The narrative of a solitary victim, besieged without context, began to fragment under documented chronology. And because the intermediary claim had previously attempted to position William as obstructive, his presence here, composed, factual, precise, altered the optics entirely. When the session adjourned for the day, observers noted that the Prince of Wales had drawn a line without raising his voice. There was an argument, he had said. There was no assault. That distinction between conflict and violence was now part of the formal record. And once something enters the record, it ceases to be rumour and becomes material for judgment. As the courtroom emptied and cameras tracked every exit, it became clear that the security dispute had expanded into something far larger, a confrontation between documented fact and narrative construction. And in that confrontation, the next phase would no longer hinge on allegation, but on which version of history could withstand scrutiny under oath. Because Prince William's sworn denial had shifted the evidentiary centre of gravity from memoir to record, the afternoon session of the same hearing took an unexpected turn, one that neither legal team had initially anticipated, but which followed inevitably from the morning's confrontation between allegation and documentation. If William had drawn a constitutional boundary, there was an argument. There was no assault. Then the logical next question became whether the internal environment described in Spare and amplified through Endgame accurately reflected the culture of the palace at that time. And it was precisely because that culture had been portrayed as hostile, punitive, and structurally aggressive that a former palace employee, whose identity had previously remained confidential under standard employment protections, agreed to testify. She was introduced simply as a former administrative aide who had worked within the household during the period referenced in the memoir. Her statement began without drama. "I worked there," she said calmly. "I witnessed tensions, disagreements, difficult conversations." The courtroom remained silent. "But I did not witness violence, and I did not witness the environment described in the book." Because the morning testimony had already placed William's denial into the official record, her words did not stand alone. They reinforced it. If William had asserted no assault occurred, and if staff records showed no corroboration, then this testimony functioned as human verification of institutional documentation. She continued, "There were raised voices at times. That is not unusual in high-pressure institutions, but there was no physical altercation. There was no incident requiring intervention. The causal sequence tightened. The intermediary claim had questioned William's openness. The memoir had questioned his conduct. His testimony had rejected the violence allegation. Now, an employee's account undermined the environmental narrative, because if the palace was not structurally hostile, then the claim of systemic persecution, a key pillar underlying broader grievances, weakened proportionally. During cross-examination, Harry's legal team pressed her on loyalty and confidentiality clauses. She did not waver. "My testimony today is not about loyalty," she replied. It is about accuracy. The judge allowed the statement to stand. But the afternoon did not end there. Because the evidentiary threshold had shifted toward lived experience, archival footage, long buried within broadcast libraries, resurfaced in media coverage concurrent with the hearing. Television networks replayed clips from the same period referenced in Spare. Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, attending community engagements, appearing composed, focused, and steady amid intense scrutiny. The timing of those appearances now carried interpretive weight. If, as the memoir implied, internal dysfunction had reached a level of volatility, the visual record told a different story, one of continuity, of institutional discipline, of visible calm under pressure. Cause produced contrast. Allegation had suggested instability. Archival footage suggested resilience. By late afternoon, analysts noted a subtle shift in tone across British media outlets. Coverage that had initially centred on Harry's security grievance began incorporating questions about narrative proportionality. And it was at this precise moment when the evidentiary tide appeared to stabilise around documentation rather than memoir that a separate criticism emerged from across the Atlantic. NBC commentators questioned William's decision to participate in a previously scheduled Radio 1 interview discussing mental health and emotional literacy, particularly given that law enforcement agencies were, at that time, reviewing materials related to the Epstein files, an issue that had already implicated Prince Andrew in prior years. The criticism was sharp. One analyst argued that speaking publicly about emotional well-being during a period of institutional scrutiny appeared tone-deaf. But here again, cause and effect converged. Because William had chosen to address mental health not in reaction to the hearing, but as part of an ongoing, long-established advocacy portfolio, and because his appearance on Radio 1 focused on listening to children, acknowledging uncomfortable emotions, and refusing to assign blame, the juxtaposition produced an unintended contrast. One brother was engaged in active litigation over personal security arrangements. The other was discussing the importance of teaching children to articulate feelings without resentment. The image mattered, not as public relations spectac, but as symbolic orientation. During a brief recess, a journalist in the gallery summarised the divergence succinctly. One narrative centres on grievance, the other centres on generational stewardship. The phrase circulated rapidly online. Back inside the courtroom, William was asked whether he wished to respond to the suggestion that his public engagement during a period of scrutiny was misjudged. He answered without defensiveness. Mental health advocacy is not opportunistic, he said. It is consistent. It is not contingent upon litigation, and it does not diminish the seriousness of any legal matter before this court. The clarity reinforced the boundary he had drawn earlier in the day. Personal dispute would not be allowed to redefine institutional mission. As proceedings adjourned for the evening, observers recognised that something fundamental had shifted. The former employee's testimony had punctured the environmental narrative. The archival footage had reinforced continuity. The Radio 1 interview had introduced generational framing. The victim under siege storyline, while not erased, now existed within a broader evidentiary context. And because context alters interpretation, the following question became unavoidable. If public perception was beginning to recalibrate, what would happen should speculation about reconciliation at the highest level resurface, particularly if that speculation excluded the heir entirely? The answer to that question would determine whether the day's stabilisation marked resolution or merely the prelude to a more strategic confrontation. London, 20 February 2026, Clarence House, 6:32 a.m. The recalibration that had begun inside the Royal Courts of Justice did not have time to settle before a new variable entered the equation. Because the evidentiary tide in court had begun to stabilise around documentation rather than memoir, and because Prince William's sworn denials had narrowed the dispute to matters of fact, the next escalation did not emerge from the courtroom, it emerged from proximity to the throne. At 6:32 multiple British outlets confirmed that King Charles III had met privately with Prince Harry earlier that week. The meeting had not been publicly scheduled. It had not been formally announced. It was described in carefully neutral language as a brief discussion. Within minutes, American networks reframed it. Reconciliation begins. One headline read, "The causal chain was immediate and predictable." If the courtroom had begun to complicate the narrative of grievance, then the optics of a father meeting his son introduced emotional symmetry. If Prince William had drawn a line in testimony, then the King's audience suggested flexibility at the apex. Commentators moved quickly. Omid Scobie posted that family conversations are continuing, adding that future engagements could occur perhaps without every member present. The phrasing was subtle, yet pointed, not including William. The implication did not need elaboration. If King Charles III and Prince Harry could reopen dialogue, even tentatively, while Prince William remained outside that process, the heir risked appearing rigid where the monarch appeared conciliatory. The question circulated across talk shows and editorials. Was Prince William becoming isolated? This was the precise optic William had anticipated days earlier, when Endgame was revived and speculation of selective reconciliation first appeared as hypothesis. Now it was no longer theoretical. The sequence was structurally coherent. The intermediary claim had cast William as unresponsive. The hearing had forced him to defend fact. The former employee's testimony had weakened the hostility narrative. Therefore, the next repositioning would occur at the level of symbolism. A king meeting his son carries generational gravity. And in monarchies, symbolism is substance. Inside Clarence House, aides emphasised that the meeting was private and limited in scope. No photographs were released. No joint statement was issued. Yet the absence of imagery did not prevent projection. Panels debated whether the Crown was choosing mercy over confrontation. But beneath the surface of speculation, a critical detail began circulating through senior correspondence, not as rumour, but as sourced clarification. The meeting had not been unconditional. According to a palace-adjacent source, familiar with the parameters of the discussion, the conversation included a clear expectation that public criticism of the heir to the throne, whether through interviews, memoirs, or affiliated commentary, would not continue. The wording was precise. There was no demand for apology. There was no immediate restoration of role. There was a boundary. If the morning's headlines framed the meeting as a thaw, the afternoon's clarifications reframed it as containment. Because if the security litigation and memoir narratives had placed sustained public pressure on the institution, then the King's intervention functioned not as surrender, but as stabilisation. It was not reconciliation in the sentimental sense. It was mitigation. The cause remained consistent. Prolonged public conflict had threatened institutional coherence. The effect was calibrated response at the level of the sovereign. When asked whether the meeting indicated a broader reintegration of the Duke of Sussex into royal duties, a palace representative replied tersely, "No change in constitutional role has occurred." That sentence carried constitutional weight. Charles remained monarch. William remained heir. Harry remained outside the working structure. The optics, however, required careful parsing. If the king was perceived as open, William could not be perceived as obstinate. Therefore, William did not issue rebuttal. He did not comment on exclusion or inclusion. He did not contest Scobie's implication. He allowed the condition embedded within the meeting, the cessation of public attacks, to stand without amplification, because amplification would validate the premise of division. By evening, analysts began to detect the structural pattern. The intermediary claim had attempted to force dialogue. The hearing had forced factual clarification. The meeting had introduced paternal authority, but authority at the apex did not dissolve succession beneath it. One senior constitutional scholar summarized it succinctly on a late-night program. The king manages the present. The heir safeguards the future. These are not competing functions. The phrase gained traction precisely because it aligned with observable reality. Charles retained the symbolic and legal centre. William retained the trajectory. And if the meeting between father and son had imposed a boundary on future public criticism of the heir, then the conflict had shifted again from courtroom contest to reputational recalibration. Because if public attacks ceased, the grievance narrative would lose velocity. And if it did not cease, the conditional nature of the meeting would become evident. Thus, the so-called slight thaw was neither capitulation nor celebration. It was a strategic pause. And in a conflict defined by narrative escalation, a pause properly framed can alter momentum more effectively than confrontation. By nightfall, one conclusion had solidified beneath the speculation. Charles held the institutional centre. William held the institutional future. And whether that equilibrium would endure depended not on sentiment, but on whether the conditions set in private would hold in public. The courtroom had barely settled from the afternoon's testimony when the next escalation arrived, not through sworn statement, but through notification screens illuminating across the press benches. Because Prince William's direct denial, reinforced by staff testimony and archival evidence, had begun recalibrating public interpretation, the narrative required a counterweight. At 5:12 p.m., multiple news alerts broke simultaneously. King Charles III had met privately with Prince Harry earlier that day. The timing was surgical. If the hearing had placed documented contradiction against memoir narrative, the announcement introduced a new axis, entirely not legal, but symbolic. Journalists inside the courtroom glanced down at their devices. Whispers travelled row by row. Within minutes, commentators outside the building began framing the meeting as a significant thaw between father and son. The language repeated rapidly. Reconciliation may be underway. A royal bridge begins to rebuild. A father reaches out. Because the day's testimony had weakened the image of Harry as solely besieged, the news reframed him as potentially reintegrated. Cause demanded countercause. If William had just asserted factual boundaries under oath, the optics of a paternal meeting risked repositioning the emotional centre of gravity. Within minutes, Omid Scobie posted analysis suggesting that the meeting could open the door to broader family conversations, adding pointedly that such discussions might not necessarily include all parties. The implication required no elaboration. If King Charles could meet with Prince Harry, and if that meeting signalled thaw, then the absence of Prince William could be interpreted not as procedural neutrality, but as distance. The narrative tension tightened instantly. Was the heir isolated? Reporters outside the royal courts of justice shouted questions toward palace representatives. Does this mean reconciliation? Will the Prince of Wales attend a future family meeting? Has the king overruled internal resistance? The cause and effect chain was unmistakable. The hearing had introduced documented rebuttal. The meeting introduced emotional imagery. Emotional imagery competes powerfully with documentation. Inside the courtroom, William did not react outwardly. The hearing remained in session, procedural and deliberate, but the strategic implications were immediate. If the father-son meeting were allowed to define the day, the earlier evidentiary shift could be overshadowed by optics of warmth. And yet within 45 minutes of the initial headlines, a secondary clarification began circulating through senior royal correspondence. The meeting, according to a source briefed on its structure, had included explicit conditions. One condition was non-negotiable. Public attacks against the heir would cease. The phrase circulated quietly at first. No further media escalation targeting the Prince of Wales. It was not framed as ultimatum. It was described as boundary. The distinction altered interpretation entirely. Because if the meeting included structured parameters regarding public conduct, then it was not an unconditional reconciliation. It was governance, damage control, containment. The shift was subtle but decisive. What had been framed as thaw now appeared calibrated. King Charles III had not yielded authority. He had exercised it. He had not reopened the family indiscriminately. He had delineated acceptable conduct within it, and the implication for Prince William was equally clear. He had not been excluded. He had been protected, the optics reversed. If the meeting imposed conditions safeguarding the heir from further public attack, then the structural hierarchy remained intact. The king as sovereign arbiter, the Prince of Wales as future custodian. Charles retained the institutional centre. William retained succession's forward trajectory. When reporters pressed for confirmation that William had been present, palace sources responded carefully. This was a private meeting between His Majesty and the Duke of Sussex. It does not alter the established constitutional responsibilities of the Prince of Wales. The phrasing was deliberate, not denial of reconciliation, not endorsement of exclusion, reaffirmation of structure, because structure, not sentiment, defines continuity. Outside, pundits attempted to reconcile the day's dual developments, sworn denial of violence in the courtroom and a controlled paternal meeting elsewhere. But the deeper sequence remained intact. The intermediary claim had attempted to pressure the heir. The hearing had corrected the record. The meeting had imposed boundaries. Each development flowed from the previous one. As evening fell and proceedings formally adjourned, the press narrative split into two interpretations. One, a family slowly healing. Two, a monarchy tightening internal discipline. The difference between those interpretations would shape the next phase of public perception. Because if the meeting truly signalled reconciliation, future conduct would reflect that shift. But if it signalled containment, then the consequences of violating those boundaries would be unmistakable. And that uncertainty whether thaw meant reunion or restraint ensured that the struggle had not ended inside the courtroom, but merely transitioned into a more strategic arena, where the next move would determine whether stability held. When the adjournment was finally called and the final procedural formalities concluded, the atmosphere outside the courtroom had shifted from confrontation to calculation. Because the day had begun with legal argument and ended with institutional repositioning, no single moment could be isolated as decisive, yet the cumulative effect was unmistakable. Prince Harry exited first. His expression was controlled but visibly strained, jaw set, shoulders rigid, surrounded by legal counsel and security. Cameras tracked every step. Questions were shouted, "Do you regret the memoir? Was the meeting with the king productive? Will there be reconciliation?" He did not respond. That silence, however, differed from the silence William had exercised earlier. Harry's silence followed exposure evidentiary challenge, testimonial contradiction, and the revelation that the King's meeting had included defined parameters. Cause had produced consequence. The intermediary narrative had failed to establish procedural legitimacy. The courtroom had undercut the violence allegation. The former staff testimony had weakened environmental claims. The meeting with King Charles III had imposed structural conditions. Each stage had narrowed the space for escalation. By contrast, Prince William did not exit through spectacle. He left through the secured side entrance customarily used by senior members of the royal family during legal proceedings. There was no press conference, no triumphal statement, no declaration of vindication. And that absence of performance was itself consequential. Because in constitutional governance, victory announced too loudly appears political. Authority maintained quietly appears institutional. Within hours, several commentators, previously sympathetic to Harry, adopted noticeably cautious language. Phrases such as alleged assault replaced earlier definitive framing. Discussions of reconciliation were tempered with acknowledgement of conditions reportedly attached to the King's meeting. The recalibration was subtle but real, and it occurred not because William counterattacked, but because he did not. The message emerging from the day's sequence required no amplification. The system protects itself. Historical precedent made that unmistakably clear. Prince Andrew, Duke of York, once central to the monarchy's working core, had been formally stripped of honorary military titles and patronages following the fallout from the Epstein scandal. The institution had not hesitated when structural preservation demanded separation. That precedent was neither invoked publicly nor threatened privately during the hearing. It did not need to be. Its existence functioned as silent doctrine. The monarchy can absorb tension. It can withstand criticism. But when pressure threatens constitutional continuity, it recalibrates. That recalibration does not occur through emotion. It occurs through structure. As dusk deepened across London, analysts reflected on what had not occurred. There had been no denunciation from William, no retaliatory exposure of internal archives, no escalation beyond necessary clarification. Instead, the day had demonstrated layered containment. Legal documentation countered memoir. Witness testimony countered narrative. The King's meeting imposed boundaries, and in the absence of overt confrontation, the structural hierarchy remained intact. Charles occupied the sovereign centre. William remained the axis of succession. If reconciliation were to occur, it would do so within that architecture, not outside it. Outside the court, one senior constitutional scholar summarised the dynamic succinctly. The Crown does not respond to pressure. It absorbs it and then defines the terms. The statement circulated quietly, not as headline, but as analysis, because the ultimate lesson of the day was neither personal nor emotional. It was procedural. The door of succession is not symbolic sentiment. It is constitutional responsibility. It opens not for grievance, nor for media leverage, nor for narrative framing. It opens for duty. And on this evening, after testimony, clarification, and controlled containment, that door remained precisely where it had always been. Closed to pressure, open only to responsibility, and for now, it remained locked. In the weeks that followed the hearing, the temperature of the conflict gradually declined, not because reconciliation was declared, but because escalation had lost its leverage. Prince Harry continued his life beyond the structural core of the monarchy, pursuing legal and media paths separate from the constitutional centre. His position remained defined not by exile, but by distance, a distance shaped as much by public narrative as by institutional boundaries. King Charles III maintained the equilibrium expected of a sovereign by meeting when necessary, imposing conditions when required, and avoiding public dramatisation. He preserved the stability of the crown without surrendering its authority. Prince William, meanwhile, strengthened his position not through retaliation, but through restraint. His selective transparency, his willingness to correct the record under oath, and his refusal to engage in performative conflict reinforced the image of an heir governed by responsibility rather than reaction. As the news cycle shifted and no new rupture emerged, media intensity subsided. Without fresh confrontation, speculation lost momentum. Justice did not arrive in spectacle. It arrived in steadiness, because in constitutional institutions, it is not noise that endures, it is discipline.